In 2020, I lived in Minneapolis, and we saw the city burn as ideologues marched through the streets during the daytime, crying out for liberation from their oppressors. And in the night, we saw firebombs thrown to light buildings on fire, regardless of whether or not there were people inside. In 2020, I got to watch with a camera, or watch from the ground carrying a camera, the 3rd Precinct burn, when we knew that there was going to be more destruction. That was just the beginning. And by now we are, we are probably becoming tired, and I wouldn't fault you for becoming tired of the never-ending grandstanding on social media about choosing this side or that side, or the legitimacy of one force or another in regards to what is going on in Israel and Gaza between Hamas and the country of Israel right now. And so if this is going to hopefully give you hopefully I'll be able to give you a sense of relief from that frustration. Because today we're going to talk about unlimited war. And we're going to talk about its consequences for a decentralizing society, and what those consequences imply that each of us as individuals are going to be responsible for. And in the end, I hope that you will be empowered, encouraged to consider the ways that you desire to live and pursue that which is right and true and good, and to understand and reinforce your responsibilities as an individual. But there was another attachment. I think it was in 2020. I made a prediction, and predictions are worth not even worth the paper they're not even printed on. But there was a prediction of a sort that but within a couple of years, I suspected that we would see the same people who affiliated themselves with Black Lives Matter also affiliating with organizations that reminded us of ISIS. And sure enough, here we are, observing in the very streets of America people praising the terrorists who willingly committed atrocities against those we'd consider non-combatants. And this is a brief glimpse of what unlimited warfare looks like. However, are we really able to say with absolute certainty that the actions of limited war are the norm and unlimited war is only to be restrained for terrorists? Now, in culture, specifically pop culture or media or movies or television or books, in the ways that we see it in propaganda and media, we oftentimes see an asymmetry of conflict. We have one group of people who are in conflict with another group of people. It's often an army or a force that is official in its statings and has a rules of engagement and has a limitation of what they're allowed to do. We oftentimes see them depicted as those in conflict with others who have no such scruples. The bad guys in movies are willing to target women and children. They're willing to sow chaos and destruction on their opponents. But the good guys are somehow able to be very specific in their only military target, their ability to only target military groups. In history, we've seen this play out in various ways, but one of them is this idea of the guerrilla, or another one would be the idea of the insurgent, which should be separate. They need to be separated to some extent. But in irregular warfare, or not irregular, in unlimited warfare, what we see, the distinction between limited and unlimited warfare, is that limited warfare restricts those who are participating in that war to only target military peoples. And that this sort of plays it into a gentleman's war or a game of chess where you have your armies and I have my armies, and I can only attack your armies and I have to spare those who are not officially a part of that army. And we like to think of World War II as a sturdy example of this, where American forces sort of liberated different parts of Europe against their German oppressors, or to be more specific, we saw a primary conflict between American, English, to a lesser extent French, and various other countries, including Russia, against the Nazi Empire, or the Nazi regime, if you would want to be so bold. But what we found out what we find out when we look through history is that America bombed Dresden and Hiroshima. Events that took place in World War II were not as cleanly cut as we would like to see in something like Band of Brothers, or even what's another good famous one? Saving Private Ryan. In fact, the closer we get to war, the more we realize how many different people become affected by it, and how many different people participate in it. So let's do a thought experiment here. Let's do a thought experiment in helping flesh out the distinction between what should fit within limited warfare and what is outside of it. At the forefront, the difference between limited and unlimited warfare implies that, for one, the people who engage in limited warfare have a limited series of legitimate targets that they can engage in, but for those who engage in unlimited warfare, anything goes. If I need to strike at the heart of your peoples, if you, let's just say, in the middle, let's start with the closest thing to an official idea of limited warfare. You have your army and I have my army, and we are at war with each other, and we're trying to maneuver our armies in a Napoleonic fashion to gain the high ground, use our cannon fire to destroy your soldiers so that you may not use your forces to destroy mine. I want to find, fix, and eliminate the enemy. It all sounds nice and clean and good until you realize that the very towns that you're instructed not to attack are the same towns that are supplying those peoples with munitions. So if I can attack your armies, can I not attack your supply depots? If I can attack your supply depots, can I not attack and limit the travel on your routes? Can I not destroy your roadways, blow up your bridges, and rip up your train stations, bomb your airfields so that you can't get supplies to the front lines? This is the first breach. This is the first crack in this idea of perfectly limited warfare, because if we understand this as a whole, when we are at war with a country, how much of that country are we at war with? Extend a little bit further on whose food do those whose food fills the bellies of those armies you're fighting against, whose metalworking fixes their cars, whose mechanics supply their vehicles, and whose oil rigs produce the fuel for their armies. You see very quickly that it's not so simple as a cleanly cut gentleman's war. But unlimited war also can come from the other end. If you start from the assumption that all military targets, or all targets that are supplying your opponent, are legitimate, how does this vary from genocide? How does this vary? How does this change? What distinguishes it from some sort of mass destruction of a population? And so we find the difficulty of distinguishing between warfighters and non-combatants difficult. And what's the solution? It's not so simple to say that those who are a man only carrying a rifle is the only person participating in war. In fact, we saw some of this very real, or we had experiences like this in Afghanistan. A personal one of mine was, I remember distinctly being in an area in Afghanistan where we knew that a Taliban force was moving on our position, and they were using individuals riding on motorcycles, these little 50cc Honda things. We knew that these people were, we knew it. We could listen to their radio traffic, and we could corroborate that radio traffic with their locations. We could direction find it. We could figure out who's talking to who. And we could figure out that the person that was riding around on his little moped or his little motorcycle, he was calling in indirect fire on our position. Does that not make that person a combatant? He didn't have a gun. He wasn't shooting at us, but he was making phone calls. He was making radio calls to try to help his forces, or his forces maneuver on our position. We were limited by the rules of engagement only to fight against those who were actively seeking to harm us. But while they were not shooting, those people were planning and plotting and placing bombs, and they were building up their resources so that they could continue in an extended conflict. And we want it to be so easy, so cut and dry, but one of the key factors that irregular warfare takes advantage of that is most distinct in our era is that those who are engaged in irregular warfare do best when they obscure their signal in the populations who harbor them. Now let's take the idea of Batman and make him the bad guy. Batman lives by his anonymity. At night, he runs around in his Caped Crusader costume, but during the daylight, he goes around as a wealthy billionaire. He's this Bruce Wayne character he blends into his environment, and we think of him in sort of this romantic style that he's a noble vigilante fighting for good. But what happens when you take that guy and he is not fighting against crime, but he's seeking to destroy the very foundation that makes, let's say, Gotham a survivable city? What happens when he's destroying good people's lives, or when he's committing the kinds of war crimes that we would see across the world? And war crimes is quite a funny term, to be honest. It's a plea for, it sometimes comes across as nothing more than a plea for legitimacy from one group to another, a signal of one's legitimacy. I am accusing them of committing war crimes. And so we've seen irregular warfare. I'm sorry, we've seen unlimited warfare take place in our very time, like in our lives. Those of you who've lived in America have seen forms of irregular war or unlimited warfare waged against you when your economy is attacked by foreign entities whose sole intent is not to compete with yours, but to destroy it. You could think of something more complicated than corporate sabotage, perhaps something more like an ideological invasion that produces nothing but the self-destruction of your population. Or the introduction of fentanyl to your population, knowing that those who are on the lower end or who are struggling in society will seek for refuge from their sorrows, and in doing so, introduce their bodies to a chemical which, if it doesn't kill them, certainly becomes a burden on the population around them. These are forms of unlimited warfare which we struggle to respond to due to their moral complexity. But what is the antidote? What is the solution? In many ways, we'd like it to be some sort of simple movie propaganda style argumentation where one thing that we have to one thing that we do is, once we determine that the bad guys are indeed bad, we are opening ourselves up to engage in complete war against them. But it's not so simple, because if we have to go into, let's just say, using something like BLM, do a hypothetical here, those people who aligned with this organization called Black Lives Matter are a diverse and wide group. And what do you do, though, when some people who ascribe to that organization, some people tie themselves into that movement, also support domestic terrorism over here? Is that something that we condemn the organization as a whole over? That is the tricky question. Ultimately, conspiracy theory is an ideology or ideologies that prey on our need for good and evil, good guys and bad guys. But what it doesn't provide, and one of the ways that you can identify a self-destructive conspiracy theory, is that it doesn't provide rules of engagement or actions therefore going forward. A conspiracy theory simply leaves the individual with a sense of self-importance without giving them, or without providing, a framework and roadmap to how they should conduct their lives. So you take the most classic conspiracy theories about how there's an evil cabal in the government or the world governments that is seeking to supplant everything that we hold to be right and true and good, and destroy our environments and destroy our homes and take away our land, or whatever the big bad is, to control the population through propaganda and force and violence, and to create a surveillance state. If we are just simply to leave it as that bad guy group over there, how are we not doing ourselves a disservice by giving ourselves that urgency of being in conflict, while simultaneously hamstringing our own horse by giving ourselves no accountability to said conflict? The issue with irregular warfare, and this is kind of where we started and where we have to return to, is that irregular warfare is closer to the actions of the individual than it is to some sort of collective problem. It's not so it's irregular warfare obscures itself in the let's just say the human condition, but it uses the very real malice of individuals to target things that they see as contributing to their woes. In an official sense, you might think you are a soldier marching to defend your country, or let's go back to even the American Civil War with Sherman's March to the Sea, where they burned and salted the fields of the South until they could get to Atlanta and the eastern seaboard near Georgia, destroying everything in their path. This was an example of total war. If you look at the wars in Europe before the Reformation, before the 1700s, well, not before the Reformation, sorry, before the 1700s, total war was closer to the regular than some form of contained limited warfare. Now, limited warfare has its tactical advantages. If I'm going to try to subdue a organization within a population, if I go to war against that entire population, do I not make more enemies in my stead? Americans had to deal with this in Afghanistan and Iraq, where if they were careless about their use of force, they would give the organizations that they were in war against, specifically the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, greater propaganda of sorts, or greater cause and ability to recruit more people to their cause. This is where the best ideas of the hearts and minds came to play. But where would it go wrong? Where does the issues of regular and irregular warfare break down? Particularly, they break down where those who are responsible for sending people to war do not pay the consequences of that war, and those who are responsible for engaging in war, who are subjugated to the rules of engagement, have no influence or contribution to, or have their agency taken away by overbearing rules of engagement. We saw this in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly in my history as a ranger, when the special operations individuals who were responsible for going out and finding these characters who were understood to be participating in some sort of terroristic activity, whether they were a bomb maker, a facilitator, a leader of a Taliban detachment, whatever their position was, if we were to, when we were going out and engaging in that conflict, when we were going out on missions in our night raids, if our rules of engagement were too tight, too restrictive, then we would find ourselves having to choose between prison or death. And that robbed the individual who was making decisions on the battlefield of the agency to make wise decisions on the ground. There's a good book worth reading called Skin in the Game by Nicholas Nassim Taleb, which pairs really, really well with two other books, one of them being Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink, and then another one being Why Young Men by Jamil Javini. And Skin in the Game identifies the need for the person closest to the problem having the agency to deal with that problem. If I approach a domestic situation, but I do not get to even make decisions based on what's going on there, rather I have to follow some formula devised by some nameless, faceless bureaucrat who gets the benefit of if I do the right thing or the wrong thing, but never has to pay the consequences. If the formula is created by somebody who is not in the arena, then I myself am playing a game. I myself am in a situation where no matter what I do, I am at a loss. I am not even able to handle it well, because I have to be more concerned about the rules of a bureaucrat than I am about solving, correcting, or aiding the situation. This extends further outward with, or this is also replicated to some extent with Jocko Willink's book Extreme Ownership, where he talks about good leadership builds agency into the people who work below you. And you can say this in corporate America, and you can see this in war fighting, is that if the leader is trying to turn his troops into automatons and not agents capable of making decisions, not only does he make his force weaker and he is a bad leader, but I'll add to that, he is immoral and undeserving of that leadership position. And then Jamil Javini's book Why Young Men addresses some of the issues that took place in Toronto during his childhood, where organizations would come in and they would fester and gain the, what do you call it, they would address, or they would target the resentment of young men who are living in what they described as oppressive situations, and give them some semblance of purpose and direction by turning them into what could be considered domestic or just general terrorists as a whole. The ideologies that came to prey on disaffected young men were the same kind of ideologies that would send them off to foreign countries to strap a bomb to their chest and blow themselves up, or to commit atrocities for the sake of liberation. So we return back to the idea of unlimited versus limited warfare. When you are the dominant power, let's just say, let's build an example here. Let's go back to some sort of clear-cut example. When you are seen as the dominant power that have established some sense of legitimacy, one part of that legitimacy is constraining your use of force against not only your own population, if at all that would be the right thing to do, but also that you are limited in your scope, because the war crimes or the atrocities that you commit against a population only justify in their eyes a greater need for you to be removed. This is one of the challenges that Donald Trump faced in 2020, where if he were to crack down too hard on the Summer of Love, as it was called, he would be condemned for being a tyrant. But he also faced the opposite side of the coin, where if he was not strict enough, if he did not employ forces that were, or deploy forces that may or may not have been at his disposal, depending on where you believe in that political argumentation, he would have looked weak and incapable of solving the issue. This is not just a simple argument for the ends justify the means, but rather what we face in this world, and what we face when we think about ourselves as individual actors, is not only are we constrained to rules of engagement that are outside of our control, but we also, and more ultimately, have to decide how then we will engage when we consider conflict. It's not good enough to prepare yourself physically for war or mentally for the potential of violence, but also it's necessary for you to be able to prepare yourself spiritually for being able to navigate complicated ethical situations that may or may not, and mostly with a desire not to participate in the use of force. So, what does this mean? If we are going to talk about gun culture as something that prioritizes the rights of the individual and seeks after some sort of community building by volunteer participation, your responsibility as an individual within gun culture is to consider what you believe to be right and wrong. What are your limitations of force? What are the things that you believe to be moral? And how do you build stopgaps, ways of protecting yourself from committing the kinds of atrocities that we condemn other people for? Parts of the reasons why we deal with issues specifically related to not TBI, but PTSD, is when people find themselves in a position where they have to make decisions in order to solve the problem that they're in, whether it's on a mission or in a deployment or a more complicated multi-day, multi-month, multi-year campaign, but they are stripped of the agency of doing that. And we can blame those who strip us of our agency all day long, but ultimately when we stand before God, or we stand before a moral maxim, we recognize that even if the situation is bad and not in our favor, we still are held responsible for what we believe to be right and true and good, and how we follow through with those things. Your church may have issues with leadership. Your school might have troubles on the board. You may find yourselves where you look up and all you see is corruption, but that does not free you purely to engage in unlimited warfare. The flip side of it, and the conflict that we have to ask ourselves questions with every day, is when we properly identify that unlimited warfare is being wielded against us through subversive means, how then do we respond? And if I could give that entire conversation in a 30-minute podcast, it would be great, but I am not that wise. I am marching through this with you as well. But one thing that we can identify, one thing that does give us a sense of direction, is instead of applying malice to large, nameless, faceless organizations, become capable of determining who are the people who are participating. It doesn't mean that just because I understand that this and that person is contributing to some form of domestic terrorism, that I am allowed open reign to commit violence. Rather, by no means, we are on the other side of the coin. We have to navigate these decisions, because if we are going to claim that decentralization is taking place, then we are responsible more so for our actions. One of the advantages of totalitarianism is that you get to blame all of your problems on somebody else. But one of the consequences of that is you are forsaking your agency. So when we come back and we talk about this idea of unlimited versus limited warfare, we can look through history at different examples where participants have engaged in limited warfare and unlimited warfare. We can see where they have stretched the rules. For example, Napoleon had to deal with his own armies looting through Italy during early parts in his before he was an emperor. But Napoleon, when he was a general and when he was rising through the French ranks, had to deal with the very real question of how does he handle the institution of looting, let's just say, in the institution of looting after you've won a battle. We've also seen this take place in American history with the early American frontiersmen, who were not necessarily uniform soldiers, but were also making decisions on what they determined to be the battlefield, which was much broader than just, simple lines and marching and so forth. And we should not be so foolish to think that there's one line, there's one, like America is a spotless. The idea of America is a spotless lamb in the case. America has engaged on both regular and irregular, limited and unlimited warfare against its enemies, whether they are in some ways foreign and in some ways domestic. And it is not to the reason why we're talking about this today is to give you a small, hopefully, breath of fresh air and a break from the aggressive moralizing that takes place on social media at this time. Anytime there's a school shooting, anytime we see some great conflict in the world, perhaps one of the more exhausting elements that take place is we see all of the bile come out of people when the emotions run so hot that our ability to, say, constrain our emotions and our verbal violence, or whatever you want to call it, gets thrown out. And we need, and it's to bring something to the table. It is this: if we are going to consider ourselves free men, and we are going to consider ourselves individuals responsible to our own thought, then one thing that is worth considering is, how do you draw the line between limited and unlimited warfare? And how would you morally navigate a complex ethical situation where you're dealing with some people who are combatants, some people who are supporting those combatants, and some people who claim to not be supporting them but are doing so by other means? Where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line between limited and unlimited warfare? I think most of us would say babies is in the unlimited side, and most of us would say women and non-combatant women are part of unlimited warfare. uh, to be morally condemned. But then there are other issues of what do you do with people who play innocent one day but pick up arms against you the next? What do you do when you are engaging with a economy that supports a war machine that is dedicated to eradicate a certain population? It's not so simple, but we are capable of navigating it. And if we are going to consider ourselves individuals in this world, and we are going to consider ourselves willing participants in our environment, we have the tools at hand. And it only comes down to us to engage in it. So if you're going to train your body, go to the gym. If you're going to train your skills, go to the range. If you're going to train your mind, go to the books. And if you want to join us in this journey, you have been listening to the Redacted Culture Cast. This is episode 143, and we've been going for a year. So we'd love to see you guys follow along with us. We'd love to see more conversations. And as we continue to participate in this conversation and bring people onto the show and have more communications, again, if you're newer to it, this environment's going to change. I'm recording in a garage right now. But this environment's going to change as we continue on through our year's travels. And if you want to support the show, you can head over to redactedllc.com. You can share this show with your friends. Our growth is basically dependent on you. If you want to share this conversation with somebody and sit down and say, hey, how would you draw the line between regular and irregular warfare, and limited and unlimited warfare? This is one way to participate in. If you'd share a show or maybe some other conversations, whether it's about faith, whether it's about conflict, whether it's about rules of engagement, whether it's about skill sets, thermal technology, night vision, gun culture, that would do us a great service. Whether you're sharing on Spotify or on YouTube or on Rumble or on Apple or on Google, we'd greatly appreciate that, because it's not an easy time to grow. It is easy for podcasts and conversations to grow if they focus entirely on the negative, the what gets the clicks. And we've seen it ourselves. If I say something that gets considered dramatic, it gets more views. But we want to remain on the straight and narrow as long as we possibly can. So if you want to support us, you can head over to redactedllc.com and jump in on either our latest t-shirt drop or pick up some of our merch. And if you just want to support the show flat out, we really appreciate it. You can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. And our podcast here is dedicated to adding the intellectual tools necessary to make your consideration of self-defense more solid. We're trying to build a foundation here of wise, intelligent, committed men and women in our communities, because this is who we are. We're not looking for saviors in politics. We are looking to ourselves to see how do we make ourselves better. And if you want to jump on, we'd love to have you along with us in this ride. That being the case, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast, episode 143 on unlimited versus limited war. And if you are going to engage in this struggle, go forth and conquer. We will talk to you soon.